Tonight, we're going through the full story, from a frightened child at the gates of Kaer Morhen to the man who became a legend without ever asking to be one. Geralt of Rivia, start to finish, nothing skipped. This video will be calm the whole way through. No loud noises or jumps. Perfect for winding down or falling asleep. Like and subscribe if you enjoy this video. Let's get into it. Part 1. Visenna and the Child. She left behind. Geralt of Rivia's story does not begin with a heroic calling or a grand prophecy, but with a quiet, bitter act of abandonment that would echo through every choice he made for the next century. He was born to Visenna, a woman of immense power who occupied a rare and complex position in the social hierarchy of the continent. Visenna was both a sorceress and a druid, a member of the Circle of Healers who possessed a profound connection to the primordial forces of nature. In the world of the Witcher, the path to becoming a sorceress almost always demands the sacrifice of a woman's fertility as a biological price for channeling the chaos of magic. Visenna was a statistical anomaly, one of the few women in history whose biology remained capable of conception despite her mastery of the arcane. However, instead of embracing this miracle, she chose to deliver her infant son to the gates of Kaer Morhen, handing him over to the witches of the Wolf School. This was not an act of casual cruelty, but a calculated, perhaps even visionary, decision. Visenna understood that her son was a child of destiny long before he knew his own name, and she believed the harsh, transformative life of a witcher was the only way he could survive what was coming. For a young boy growing up in the shadows of the Blue Mountains, the absence of a mother was the foundational scar upon his psyche. Geralt was raised in a world of men who had been stripped of their own families by poverty, war, or the law of surprise. Yet his situation was uniquely painful. He was not a foundling in the traditional sense. He knew his mother was alive, and that she had deliberately traded him for a life of mutation. This knowledge fostered a deep-seated cynicism toward mages and the concept of destiny. To Geralt, sorcery was the force that had robbed him of a home, and destiny was merely a pretty word used by the powerful to justify the suffering of the weak. He viewed himself as a surplus human, a boy whose mother had looked at him and decided that a life as a professional killer was a better fate than a life by her side. This psychological trauma turned the crumbling fortress of Kaer Morhen from a sanctuary into a place of exile, where the only warmth was found in the shared hardship of his peers and the gruff, unwavering discipline of the masters who oversaw his training. In the void left by Visenna, Geralt found his only true father figure in Vesemir, the master-at-arms of the Wolf School. Vesemir was a man who had seen the rise and fall of kings and the slow, agonizing decline of the Witcher profession. Yet he maintained a sense of professional integrity that Geralt would eventually adopt as his own. Vesemir did not offer the young boy hugs or words of comfort. Instead, he offered the sword, the comb, and the cold logic of the hunt. He provided the structure that Geralt's life lacked, teaching him that while he might have been abandoned by his blood, he was chosen by his school. This relationship was the only thing that kept Geralt from spiraling into total nihilism. Vesemir became the anchor for Geralt's identity, the one person who could look past the mutations and see the boy who was still searching for a reason to exist. It was under Vesemir's watchful eye that Geralt began to build the persona of the White Wolf, a man who would eventually redefine what it meant to be a Witcher in a world that no longer wanted them. The mystery of his father is a recurring thread in the broader lore. Often whispered to be a warrior named Corin, though Geralt himself rarely wasted time on such speculation. In the game canon, his origin is treated as a closed door that he refuses to open because the pain behind it is too great. He spent decades resenting the maternal instincts that Visenna had suppressed to leave him, and when they finally met years later on the road, the encounter was marked by a cold, professional distance. Geralt realized that his mother had become a stranger, a woman whose choices had created a monster, but who could no longer offer the love a son requires. This meeting confirmed his belief that family is not a matter of blood, but of choice and loyalty. The boy who was left behind at the gates of Kaer Morhen realized that he had survived because he had stopped waiting for his mother to come back. He had become a witcher because there was no one else for him to be, and the fortress in the mountains had become the only home he would ever truly recognize. Ultimately, the abandonment by Visenna served as the crucible for Geralt's unique worldview. It gave him an outsider's perspective on the world of the powerful, allowing him to see the mages and the royalty of the continent for what they truly were. People who would sacrifice anything, even their own children, to maintain their grip on the world. This experience instilled in him a fierce independence and a refusal to be a pawn in anyone else's game. He walked the path not as a servant of the mages, but as a man who had survived their worst impulses. The child she left behind did not die. He transformed into a legend that would eventually overshadow the very sorcerers who had cast him out. Visenna's decision, while tragic, provided the continent with its greatest protector, even if that protector spent his entire life wondering why he wasn't enough to make her stay. Part 2. The Trial of the Grasses and what it did to him. The Trial of the Grasses is the most horrific and transformative event in a witcher's life, a biological meat grinder that few children survive. It involves the ingestion of highly toxic alchemical concoctions known as the grasses, which are designed to break down the human body and rebuild it from the cellular level. For most recruits, this process results in an agonizing death as their nervous systems collapse and their internal organs fail under the weight of the mutagens. Out of every 10 children who enter the laboratory at Kaer Morhen, only 3 typically walk out as witches. Geralt was one of those 3, but his experience went far beyond the standard ordeal. He showed such an unusual and terrifying resilience to the initial mutations that the mages and witcher elders decided to use him as a subject for even further experimental trials. They pushed his body past the limits of known human endurance, subjecting him to a second wave of mutations that were meant to see just how much a human could take before they finally broke. These additional experimental trials achieved their goal, but they left a permanent physical mark on Geralt that would define his appearance forever. The chemical stress of the second round of mutations was so absolute that it stripped every drop of pigment from his body. His skin became as pale as marble, and his hair, which had been a standard brown, turned into a shocking milky white. This transformation earned him the title of Gwynblyde, the White Wolf, but it was much more than a cosmetic change. The extra mutations granted him physical abilities that far exceeded those of a standard witcher. His reflexes became lightning fast. His eyesight gained a supernatural clarity in total darkness, and his resistance to toxins and poisons became so absolute that he could ingest decoctions that would kill a normal man 10 times over. He became the pinnacle of the Witcher project, a mutant among mutants, a weapon that was sharpened to a finer point than any of his brothers. However, the cost of this power was a level of social alienation that most people can barely imagine. To a common peasant, a witcher is already a freak. A witcher with hair the color of bone and eyes like a cat is a demon, Geralt's appearance acted as a constant, visual reminder to everyone he met that he was no longer human. He became a ghost in a world of flesh and blood, a man who walked into a tavern and caused the conversation to stop. The mutations didn't just change his eyes and his hair, they numbed his emotional responses, a side effect intended to help witches face the most horrific monsters without flinching. This emotional dampening, combined with the way society treated him, led to a profound sense of isolation. He had survived something that had killed his friends and erased his humanity, and he was left to wander a continent that viewed his survival as an insult to the natural order. The psychological toll of surviving the experimental trials is a core part of Geralt's internal monologue throughout the saga. He often wonders if the boy he was still exists somewhere beneath the layers of pigment-stripped skin and cat-eyed vision. He is a man who was literally rebuilt by science to be a killer, and that reality creates a fundamental crisis of self. Does he have a soul, or is he just a collection of successful mutations? The physical pain of the trials stayed with him as a phantom memory, a reminder of the night he lay on a cold stone table while his body tore itself apart to please a group of mages. This trauma gave him a unique perspective on suffering. He had experienced the absolute limit of what the human body could endure, which made the petty problems of kings and merchants seem insignificant by comparison. He had been through the fire, and he had come out as something cold and hard. The trial of the grasses and the subsequent experiments created the White Wolf, but they also created a man who was trapped between two worlds. He was too fast and too strong for the world of men, yet he possessed a conscience and a memory that prevented him from being a mindless monster. The white hair and the pale skin became the banners of a man who was born twice, once from a mother who left him, and once from a laboratory that broke him. This dual origin is why Geralt is so resilient. He has already died once on that table in Kaer Morhen. The world can throw ghouls, vampires, and emperors at him, but nothing will ever be as terrifying as the alchemical chaos that rewrote his DNA. He is the ultimate survivor, a mutant who carries the scars of his creation on every inch of his body, and whose very existence is a testament to the fact that what doesn't kill you can make you something much, much more dangerous. Part 3. The name he chose, and the life he built. In the world of the witches, a name is one of the few things a man can actually own. After surviving the mutations and completing their training, young witches were encouraged by Vesemir and the other masters to take on surnames and titles. This wasn't for vanity, but for professional survival. A witcher with a name like Geralt of Rivia sounded like a man with a home and a history, someone a merchant or a village elder could trust to fulfill a contract. Without a surname, a witcher was just a nameless freak, a drifter who lacked the human touch necessary to secure a deal. Geralt, being a young man with a flair for the dramatic and a lingering desire for the nobility he'd been denied, originally wanted to call himself Geralt Roger Eric du Haut-Bellegarde. It was a name that sounded like it belonged in a palace in Toussaint, a sprawling, aristocratic mouthful that reflected a boy's desperate attempt to give himself the family he never had. Vesemir's reaction to this name was one of the few moments of genuine humour in Geralt's early life. The old master-at-arms laughed him out of the courtyard, telling him that such a ridiculous name would only make him a laughingstock and get him killed by a suspicious mob before he even reached his first drowner. Vesemir understood the politics of the road far better than the young Geralt. He knew that a witcher needed a name that sounded solid, geographical, and unremarkable. After a period of frustration, Geralt eventually settled on of Rivia. He wasn't from Rivia. He had no connection to the kingdom whatsoever, but it was a place that sounded respectable and distant enough that no one would bother to check his papers. He took the identity seriously, even going so far as to practice a Rivian accent to ensure that his cover was believable. He built a life on a lie, creating a history for a man who had no past other than the stones of Kaer Morhen. The act of choosing his own identity was a profound moment of agency for a boy who had been a pawn of his mother and the mages for his entire life. By naming himself, Geralt was reclaiming his own story. He was saying that he was no longer just a subject of the trials or a surplus child. He was Geralt of Rivia, a professional monster hunter. This self-constructed identity became the armor he wore on the path. It allowed him to move through the world with a sense of belonging, however fabricated. The name gave him a tether to the map of the continent, a way to anchor himself in a world that was constantly trying to push him away. He wasn't just Gwynblyde the mutant. He was a man of Rivia, a citizen of the north who happened to have cat eyes and a silver sword. There is a supreme, cosmic irony in the way this fake name eventually became legitimate. Years later, during the Second War with Nilfgaard, Geralt found himself in the middle of a battle at a bridge over the Yaruga River. In a moment of characteristic inability to remain neutral, he led a charge to protect the forces of Queen Meve, of Lyria and Rivia. For his incredible bravery on the battlefield, the Queen officially knighted him, bestowing upon him the formal title of Geralt of Rivia. The name he had invented as a marketing tool and a psychological shield had become a legal reality. He had become a knight of the very kingdom he had pretended to be from, a turn of events that Geralt found both absurd and deeply satisfying. It was a moment where the man he had made himself into finally overtook the boy he had been forced to be. The life Geralt built around this name was one of rugged independence and professional integrity. He didn't serve a king or a mage. He served the path. His name became a brand, a sign that the job would get done without the political complications that usually followed human warriors. Over the decades, Geralt of Rivia became a name whispered in fear by monsters and in hope by villagers. He had taken the nothingness of his birth and the horror of his mutations and turned them into a reputation that spanned the entire continent. He had proved that identity is something you earn, not something you are born with. By picking a surname and practicing an accent, a nameless mutant had turned himself into a legend that even the Queen of Rivia was forced to recognize. Geralt's name is a symbol of his resilience. It represents the transition from a child who was abandoned to a man who is the master of his own fate. He took a name that didn't belong to him and made it so famous that the world forgot it was a lie. This is the core of Geralt's character. He is a man who builds his own world out of the wreckage of what others have left behind. He is the White Wolf, Gwynblyde, and the Butcher of Blaviken. But at his core, he will always be Geralt of Rivia, the man who chose who he wanted to be when the universe refused to give him a choice. He built a life of honor on a foundation of bone-white hair and a fake accent, proving that even a mutant can become a man of standing. Part 4. The Butcher of Blaviken. The title of the Butcher of Blaviken is the heaviest burden Geralt carries, a dark label that defines his public reputation more than his heroism ever could. The events that led to this name took place in the small, unremarkable town of Blaviken, where Geralt found himself trapped in a lethal moral impasse between two equally flawed individuals. On one side was Stregobor, a cold and manipulative wizard who believed in a prophecy about a curse of the Black Sun that turned girls born during an eclipse into monsters. On the other was Renfri, a cursed princess turned bandit leader who had been hunted by Stregobor since her childhood. Renfri arrived in Blaviken with a gang of professional killers intent on forcing Stregobor out of his tower by threatening to massacre every innocent person in the town market. It was a classic lesser evil argument that would haunt Geralt's philosophy for the rest of his life. Geralt tried to mediate, trying to convince Renfri to walk away and Stregobor to show some shred of humanity, but both were locked in a cycle of vengeance that had no exit. On the morning of the market, Geralt realized that Renfri's gang was preparing to fulfill their ultimatum. He had to make a choice. Let the bandits slaughter the townsfolk while he remained neutral, or intervene and kill the attackers to prevent a greater massacre. He chose the latter, she moving into the market with the speed and lethality that only a witcher possesses. He dismantled the gang in a blur of steel, finally facing Renfri in a duel that ended with her death in the mud. He had saved the town, but the cost was a bloodbath that turned the marketplace into a charnel house. The tragedy of Blaviken is that the townsfolk did not see the ultimatum or the threat. They did not know about the Tridem ultimatum, or the fact that Renfri was prepared to murder them all. To the people of Blaviken, they simply saw their local marketplace suddenly erupt into a scene of horrific violence. They saw a pale-skinned mutant with white hair and cat eyes slaughtering a group of people, including a young woman who looked like a princess. They didn't see a protector. They saw a murderous freak who had brought his bloodlust to their peaceful town. Instead of thanking him, they stoned him and drove him out of the gates, branding him with the title of Butcher. It was a moment of profound betrayal that confirmed Geralt's belief that humans are often more monstrous than the creatures he hunts. The title of Butcher became a shadow that followed Geralt through every kingdom and every tavern on the continent. It was a name used by those who wanted to dismiss him as a mindless killer, a way to justify their own fear and prejudice. For Geralt, the name was a constant reminder of the failure of the lesser evil. He had chosen what he thought was the right path, only to be punished for it by the very people he had saved. It taught him that in the world of men, the truth doesn't matter as much as the narrative. The people of Blaviken chose the name they gave him because it was easier to hate a butcher than it was to acknowledge that they were so helpless that they needed a mutant to save them. Blaviken changed Geralt's approach to the path forever. It made him even more reluctant to involve himself in human affairs and reinforced his desire to hide behind the Witcher's code. He realized that no matter how hard he tried to do the right thing, he would always be seen as a monster by someone. The weight of the title added a layer of weariness to his eyes that never truly left. He began to internalize the name, using it as a shield to keep people at a distance. If they already thought he was a butcher, they wouldn't expect him to be a hero, which meant they wouldn't be disappointed when he failed. It was a dark, psychological armor that protected his heart, but cost him his soul. Ultimately, The Butcher of Blaviken is a story about the impossible nature of moral choices. Geralt acted on his conscience and saved lives, but he lost his reputation and his standing in the process. It is the defining moment of his professional life, a reminder that the path is not just about silver and monsters, but about the messy, ungrateful reality of human nature. He carries the name like a scar, a symbol of the night he realized that sometimes the only way to save a town is to let them hate you for it. He is a man who did the right thing for the wrong reasons, or the wrong thing for the right reasons, and the continent has never stopped reminding him of it. Section 2. The Road and the Code. Part 5, Witcher, Neutrality and Why Geralt Could Never Quite Keep It. The concept of Witcher neutrality is the most famous and most frequently broken rule in Geralt's life. Theoretically, the Witcher's Code dictates that a professional monster hunter must never take a side in human wars, political disputes, or religious conflicts. This philosophy was originally designed to protect the Witcher schools from becoming political targets. If Witchers were seen as independent contractors who only cared about monsters and coin, they were less likely to be hunted down by the armies of kings or the inquisitions of priests. Geralt clings to this idea of neutrality as a psychological sanctuary, a way to distance himself from the horrific violence and systemic cruelty of the world. He often quotes the code as a shield, using it to refuse contracts that involve human targets or to avoid becoming a pawn in the endless games of the royalty. However, the Witcher's Code is largely a myth. There is no central book of laws for witchers. The code is something Geralt and others invented to give themselves a sense of professional standing and to manage the expectations of their clients. Geralt's greatest struggle is that his internal moral compass is far too strong for the cold neutrality his profession demands. He is a man who cannot stand by and watch the innocent be harmed, even if the harm is being done by other humans. This conflict is captured in his most famous and ironic quote, "If I'm to choose between one evil and another, I'd rather not choose at all." It is a statement of intent that he fails to uphold in almost every situation he faces. His humanity, however dampened by the mutations, keeps dragging him back into the very entanglements that neutrality was supposed to prevent. The failure of neutrality is the central theme of Geralt's journey. He wants to be a man who only sees drowners and griffins, but he constantly finds himself looking at the suffering of people. Whether it's helping a group of non-humans escape a pogrom or protecting a village from a corrupt lord, Geralt's choices are driven by a sense of justice that he tries to pretend he doesn't have. This unwanted heroism is what makes him a legend, but it's also what makes his life so dangerous. By taking a side, he becomes a target. He realizes that neutrality is a luxury that the world rarely affords to those who have the power to act. In a world of absolute grey, the act of standing in the center is itself a choice that has consequences. Geralt's struggle with neutrality is also a struggle with his own identity. He wants to be the professional mutant that Vesemir trained him to be, a man who takes the coin and moves on without a second thought. But the boy who was abandoned by Visenna still feels the pain of others. His inability to remain neutral is the proof that the trial of the grasses failed to strip away his soul. He remains a man of conscience in a world of monsters, a paradox that defines his every interaction. He often resents his own morality, viewing it as a weakness that makes his life on the path harder, yet he can never quite bring himself to ignore a cry for help. Ultimately, Witcher neutrality is the lie that Geralt tells himself so he can keep walking the path. It provides him with a framework for his life, but it's a framework that he outgrows with every contract. The code is the armor, but his heart is the vulnerability. He is a man who tries to be a machine, but remains a human, a professional who tries to stay out of the mud, but ends up covered in it anyway. This failure is his greatest triumph. It is the reason he is the White Wolf, and not just another nameless mutant. He chose to care in a world that taught him not to, and that is a choice that no code could ever truly contain. Part 6. The Signs, the Swords, and the Path. A witcher's life is defined by the tools of the trade and the relentless, grinding reality of the path. Geralt carries 2 swords on his back, a visual signature that marks him as a professional in any tavern on the continent. The steel sword is for humans and creatures of this world, while the silver sword is reserved for the monsters that arrive during the conjunction of the spheres. This distinction is more than just practical. It is a reflection of the Witcher's role as the thin line between humanity and the supernatural. The silver is expensive, fragile, and lethal to the creatures of chaos, making it the most sacred tool in Geralt's arsenal. Carrying both is a reminder that a Witcher must be prepared for two kinds of violence, the mundane and the magical. In addition to his blades, Geralt utilizes a basic form of combat magic known as signs. These are low-level incantations that are a shadow of the power wielded by sorceresses like Yennefer, yet they are lethal in the hands of a trained warrior. He uses Ard for telekinetic force, Igni for flame, Erden for magical traps, Quen for a protective shield, and Axai for mind manipulation. These signs are designed to be used in the heat of battle, cast with a single hand while the other holds the sword. They are tactical tools that provide the edge a mutant needs to survive a fight with a beast that is 10 times his size. For Geralt, magic is not an art or a science. It is a utility, a way to stay alive on the road. The daily reality of the path is far less glamorous than the songs of the bards suggest. It is a life of poverty, grime, and constant physical danger. Geralt spends his days in muddy villages, stagnant sewers, and haunted forests, tracking things that most people would rather pretend didn't exist. He is often met with suspicion and hatred, paid in scraps of coin for risking his life to save people who will stone him as soon as the monster is dead. His primary tool in this work is the Witcher's sense, a heightened state of perception that allows him to track a scent across a mile of forest, or hear the frantic heartbeat of a hidden monster. It is a sensory overload that makes the world feel loud, sharp, and constantly threatening. Alchemy is the final pillar of Geralt's survival. Before a hunt, he prepares oils for his blades and decoctions for his blood. These potions grant him the strength of a bear or the speed of a cat, but they are highly toxic, even to his mutated biology. A Witcher in a state of alchemical intoxication is a terrifying sight. His skin turns even paler, his veins bulge and turn black, and his eyes become absolute voids of darkness. It is a state of controlled mutation, a way to temporarily push his body even further past its limits. This reliance on toxins is a reminder of the biological price he pays for his power. He is a man who must poison himself to protect others. The path is also a spiritual journey, a long road of solitude and reflection. Geralt has spent a century walking the continent, seeing the rise and fall of kingdoms and the slow change of the landscape. He is a witness to the best and worst of humanity, a man who has seen everything and forgotten very little. The road is his only home, and the two swords are his only permanent companions. He is a professional who takes pride in his work, even when the work is dirty and the world is ungrateful. He finds a sense of peace in the clarity of the hunt, a moment where the world stops being a political mess and becomes a simple matter of tracking and killing. Ultimately, the swords, the signs, and the path are the elements that make Geralt who he is. They are the artifacts of a dying profession, the tools of a man who is the last of his kind. He is a master of a craft that the world is trying to forget, a warrior who carries the weight of 1,000 years of Witcher history on his back. The steel and silver are the symbols of his dual nature, a man who is part of the world and a monster who is outside of it. As he walks the path, he remains the white wolf, the predator who protects the prey, the mutant who carries the burden of humanity in a world that has lost its way. Part 7. Dandelion and the Value of Being Witnessed. If Geralt is the silent, grey-scale shadow of the continent, then Julian Alfred Pancratz, known to the world as Dandelion, is its most vibrant and loudest splash of colour. Their friendship is one of the great paradoxes of the Witcher world, a stoic, mutated monster hunter whose very biology is designed to dampen emotion, paired with a flamboyant, narcissistic bard who lives for drama, romance, and the sound of his own voice. They first met at a talent contest in Goulet, where Dandelion was being chased by the brothers of a girl he had seduced, and Geralt, in a typical moment of failed neutrality, ended up acting as his bodyguard. On the surface, they have nothing in common. Geralt is a creature of mud, blood, and silence, while Dandelion is a creature of silk, wine, and song. Yet, for nearly half a century, Dandelion has remained the Witcher's closest and most loyal friend, providing a type of companionship that no other person on the path could offer. Dandelion serves a vital function in Geralt's life. He provides the value of being witnessed. A Witcher's life is inherently isolating. They move through villages as ghosts, their deeds forgotten or twisted into horror stories as soon as they leave. Dandelion changed that narrative. He took the grim, bloody reality of Geralt's contracts and beautified them through his ballads, turning the Butcher of Blaviken into the legendary White Wolf in the public imagination. He gave Geralt a legacy and a humanity that a mutant usually lacks. While Geralt often grumbles about the factual inaccuracies in Dandelion's songs, protesting that he didn't actually fight 100 drowners or rescue a dozen virgins, he secretly relies on the bard to remind the world and himself that he is more than just a killing machine. Dandelion is the one who records Geralt's heart when Geralt is too stoic to admit he has one. The bard also provides Geralt with a connection to the human world that the Witcher's mutations often strip away. Dandelion is deeply social, a man who knows the gossip of every court and the layout of every tavern. He drags Geralt into conversations, parties, and political messes that the Witcher would otherwise avoid, forcing him to interact with the world as a person rather than just a contractor. In the games, Dandelion is often the one who handles the logistical side of Geralt's life, managing his reputation and providing him with information that a man living in the woods would never encounter. He is the bridge between the path and the civilization that Geralt protects but can never truly inhabit. Dandelion's presence is a reminder that even a mutant needs a friend who knows his favorite drink and his most embarrassing secrets. Their bond is tested by the sheer danger of Geralt's life. Dandelion has no combat skills, no magical protection, and a physical fragility that makes him a liability in a fight with a monster. Yet, he follows Geralt into some of the darkest corners of the continent, armed only with a lute and a sharp wit. This loyalty is something Geralt deeply respects, even if he expresses it through insults and sighs. He has saved Dandelion's life more times than he can count, often travelling across entire kingdoms to pull the bard out of a dungeon or a hangman's noose. Dandelion, in return, has provided Geralt with a home in the city of Novigrad and a sense of family that doesn't involve mutagens or silver. He is the keeper of Geralt's stories, the man who ensures that when the last Witcher finally falls, his name will still be sung in the taverns. Dandelion is the conscience of the legend. He sees the man behind the white hair, the one who worries about his friends and feels the weight of every failed contract. He doesn't fear Geralt's mutations or his reputation. He treats him with a casual, annoying familiarity that humanizes the mutant. In a world that views Geralt as a tool or a freak, Dandelion views him as a brother. Their friendship is the proof that Geralt's journey is not just about killing monsters, but about finding a way to belong to a world that tried to cast him out. Dandelion is the bard who turned a butcher into a hero, ensuring that the White Wolf would never truly have to walk the path alone. Part 8, Yennefer of Vengerberg, the Djinn and the Wish. The relationship between Geralt and Yennefer of Vengerberg is the most passionate, destructive and eternal bond on the continent. A connection forged in magic and tempered by a century of shared tragedy. They first met in the town of Rinde, where Geralt was desperately seeking a cure for a magical ailment that had struck Dandelion. Yennefer, a sorceress of immense power and even greater ambition, was attempting to capture a djinn, a primordial spirit of air, to restore her own fertility and increase her magical standing. The encounter was a chaotic collision of two powerful wills. Geralt was drawn to Yennefer's cold beauty and her absolute refusal to be controlled, while Yennefer saw in the Witcher a man who was as much an outcast as she was. Their meeting culminated in a desperate struggle to survive the djinn's wrath, an event that would bind them together forever. To save Yennefer from the creature's lethal retaliation, Geralt used his third and final wish from the djinn to bind their fates together. The exact wording of the wish is a subject of intense debate among fans and scholars within the game's lore, but its effect was absolute. The universe was now forced to ensure that their paths would always cross. This last wish created a magical tether that has pulled them together through deaths, wars, and decades of separation. In The Witcher 3, this bond is directly addressed during a quest where they hunt down another djinn to undo the spell, forcing Geralt to decide if their love is a genuine emotional connection or merely a supernatural compulsion. It is the ultimate question of their relationship. Is the fire real, or is it just the magic of the wish burning? The dynamic between Geralt and Yennefer is one of mutual stubbornness and fierce independence. Both are individuals who have been physically and psychologically rebuilt by their respective professions. Geralt by the mutations, and Yennefer by the horrific transformations of sorcery. They are both survivors of trauma who hide their vulnerabilities behind layers of cynicism and coldness. This makes their relationship incredibly volatile. They often argue, separate for years, and hurt each other in ways that only those who truly know each other can. Yet, they always return to one another. They are the only people who truly understand the cost of their power and the isolation of their existence. Yennefer is the only person who can challenge Geralt's stoicism, and Geralt is the only one who can see the wounded girl beneath the sorceress's mask. Yennefer is also the spiritual mother to Ciri, a role that solidified her connection to Geralt. Their shared love for the girl turned them from lovers into a family, providing them both with a purpose that went beyond their own survival. While Geralt provided Ciri with the sword and the path, Yennefer provided her with the magic and the foundation of her identity. This shared responsibility is what truly anchored them in the later years. They became the parents of the child of destiny, a role that required them to set aside their own egos and work together to protect the most important person in their lives. Their relationship is the emotional heart of the saga, a reminder that even in a world of monsters and politics, love is the only thing that can't be explained away by a mutagen or a spell. Geralt and Yennefer are two halves of a whole that the world tried to break. They are the mutant and the sorceress, the wolf and the obsidian star. Their love is not a fairy tale. It is a long, difficult, and often painful struggle to find a sense of peace in a world that is constantly trying to tear them apart. Whether the bond is the result of a djinn's wish or a genuine alignment of souls, the result is the same. They are the constants in each other's lives. As Geralt walks the path and Yennefer moves through the courts, they are always looking for the next time their fates will collide. They are the eternal lovers of the continent, a testament to the idea that some connections are so deep that not even the end of the world can truly break them. Section 3. The Law of Surprise. Part 9. The Feast in Cintra and the Claim he didn't mean to make. The night that changed Geralt's life forever took place in the grand banquet hall of Cintra, during a feast hosted by Queen Calanthe to decide the marriage of her daughter and Pavetta. Geralt attended as a guest under the name Lord of Ravix, intending to act as a silent observer to the political maneuvering of the northern nobility. However, the evening was interrupted by the arrival of a knight in monstrous armor, calling himself Dunny, the Urcheon of Erlenwald. Dunny claimed Pavetta's hand through the Law of Surprise, having saved the life of Pavetta's father, King Regner, years before. Calanthe, the Lioness of Cintra, was prepared to have the knight murdered to protect her dynastic plans, but Geralt, unable to stand by and watch a violation of ancient custom and a slaughter of a man who had acted honorably, intervened to save Dunny's life. In the aftermath of the battle, Geralt used his Witcher signs to help break the curse that had kept Dunny in a bestial form, returning him to his human shape. When Dunny, filled with gratitude, asked the Witcher what he wanted as a reward, Geralt didn't ask for gold or a horse. In a moment of characteristic impulsiveness and a desire to mock the very idea of destiny, he invoked the Law of Surprise, that which you already have, but do not know. He didn't believe in the supernatural binding force of the custom. He thought it was just a poetic way to avoid a reward. But at that exact moment, Pavetta was overcome by a wave of nausea, revealing she was already pregnant with a child. The room went silent as the realization hit. Geralt had accidentally claimed the unborn Ciri as his destiny. This event created a psychological crisis for Geralt that would last for years. He was a Witcher, a sterile mutant whose life was a series of lonely nights and bloody contracts. The idea of having a child, she especially one tied to him by a magical decree, was a horrific irony. He spent the next 6 years trying to ignore the claim, taking contracts in distant lands and refusing to return to Cintra to see the girl. He believed that he could outrun destiny, that he could simply pretend the feast in Cintra hadn't happened. He didn't want the responsibility of a daughter, and he didn't want to believe that his life was part of some larger cosmic plan. He viewed the Law of Surprise as a relic of a primitive past that had no place in his professional, rational life. The Law of Surprise is a fundamental rule of the Witcher world, a supernatural contract that the universe enforces with absolute rigidity. By invoking it, Geralt had unwittingly tied his soul to the most important individual in the multiverse. He didn't realize that Ciri was the carrier of the Elder Blood, or that his role as her protector was the reason he had survived the experimental mutations at Kaer Morhen. He thought he was just a mutant who had made a bad joke at a party. But as the years passed, the coincidences of the path began to pile up. Every time he tried to move away from his destiny, the universe pushed him back towards Cintra and the girl with the ashen hair. The law was a gravity that he couldn't escape, no matter how fast he rode. Ultimately, the feast in Cintra was the moment Geralt's solitude was broken forever. He had gone looking for a bit of food and a quiet night, and he had come away with a daughter. This claim he didn't mean to make is the turning point of his entire story. The moment he transitioned from being a solitary hunter to being the father of a legend. He spent years fighting the connection, but the law of surprise had already done its work. Ciri was already his, and he was already hers, a reality that would eventually lead him back to the burning streets of Cintra to find the child he had tried so hard to forget. Part 10. The second meeting and why. He finally accepted her. Geralt's final acceptance of his destiny did not happen in a palace, but in the muddy yard of a merchant's farm in the forests of Sodden. After the fall of Cintra and the slaughter of its people, Ciri had become a refugee, wandering the war-torn landscape alone. Geralt, who had finally been convinced by the mounting evidence of destiny to find her, had been searching for the girl across the north. They were reunited by a stroke of pure, unadulterated surprise, when Geralt happened to save a merchant named Urga from a pack of monsters. As a reward, he again invoked the law of surprise, and when he arrived at Urga's home, he found that the merchant's wife had recently taken in an orphaned girl from the war. That girl was Ciri. The moment they recognized each other is the emotional anchor of the entire Witcher saga. Geralt realized that the universe had spent years engineering this specific meeting, bypassing his cynicism and his refusal to cooperate. He saw the girl who had lost everything: her grandmother, her home, and her identity, and he realized that he was the only one in the world who could protect her. He stopped arguing with destiny in that moment, setting aside his nihilism and his witcher's code to embrace the role of a father. He didn't take her because of a contract or a custom. He took her because she was his, and the love he felt for her was more powerful than any mutagen in his blood. The second meeting was the death of Geralt the solitary mutant and the birth of Geralt the protector. The acceptance was also a realization of his own humanity. For a century, Geralt had told himself that he was a heartless freak, a creature of professional violence who felt nothing. But as he held the crying girl in that farmyard, he realized that the mutations had failed to kill his capacity for love. Ciri was the proof that he was still a man, someone capable of a bond that transcended the path. He saw that his life had a purpose that went beyond killing drowners for scraps of coin. He was the shield for the child of destiny, a role that gave him a reason to stand for something in a world that was falling apart. He had finally found the something more that he had been searching for since the night Visenna had left him. Taking Ciri under his wing was the most dangerous choice he had ever made. He knew that Nilfgaard was hunting her, and that the mages would eventually come for her blood. By accepting her, he was declaring war on the world's most powerful forces. But he didn't hesitate. He realized that the law of surprise wasn't a curse, but a gift that had saved him from himself. He took Ciri to the only place he felt she could be safe, the mountain fortress of Kaer Morhen. The road north was the beginning of their new life, a journey where the Witcher and the princess would learn to be a family. Geralt had finally stopped running from the surprise and started being the person she needed him to be. The second meeting was the fulfillment of Ithlin's prophecy and the law of surprise. It was the moment the white wolf and the lion cub became an inseparable unit. Geralt had spent his life believing he was an observer of history, but through Ciri he became its central actor. He realized that destiny is not a script that is written for you, but a choice that you make when the world is at its darkest. He chose to be a father, and in doing so, he saved the girl who would eventually save the world. The reunion at Sodden was the end of his loneliness, and the beginning of a legend that would redefine the continent. Part 11. Taking her to Kaer Morhen. The journey to Kaer Morhen was a period of transition and discovery for both Geralt and Ciri. He led the young princess through the wild, war-torn landscape of the north, moving through the forests and the mountain passes to reach the hidden valley of the Wolf School. For Geralt, it was an unprecedented move. The fortress had never been intended for anyone but Witcher recruits and the masters who trained them. By bringing a young girl, especially one of royal blood, into the keep of the Elder Sea, he was breaking every tradition of his order. He was opening the world of the Witchers, a world of grime, violence, and secrets, to someone who represented the highest level of human civilization. It was a collision of two worlds that shouldn't have met, yet it felt like the only natural thing to do. During this journey, Geralt began the process of turning Ciri into a survivor. He didn't treat her like a princess or a fragile child. He treated her with the same professional directness he showed his fellow witches. He taught her how to hide her trail, how to sleep in the mud, and how to read the signs of the forest. He realized that the girl possessed a natural agility and a sharp, inquisitive mind that made her a perfect student. This road was where their bond was truly forged, moving past the trauma of Cintra and the shock of their reunion to find a sense of mutual trust. Geralt realized that Ciri wasn't a burden to be carried, but a partner to be trained. He saw in her the resilience that he had found in himself during the trials, a realization that made him even more determined to protect her. The arrival at Kaer Morhen marked the beginning of the golden age of their relationship. The fortress was a ruin, a cold and haunted pile of stone at the edge of the world. But to Ciri, it became a home. She was surrounded by the only uncles she would ever know, Vesemir, Eskel, and Lambert, men who treated her with a gruff, honest affection that was far more sincere than the protocols of the Cintran court. Geralt supervised her training with a combination of strictness and pride, watching as she mastered the Witcher's dance and the swordplay of the wolf. He taught her that a Witcher doesn't just fight with steel. They fight with their mind, their senses, and their surroundings. They spent the winter in the high mountains, sheltered from the wars and the politics of the south, a period of peace that neither of them had ever known. As this winter also turned the two strangers into a family. Geralt realized that Ciri had provided him with the sense of belonging that he had been missing since his own childhood. He wasn't just her teacher. He was her father in every way that mattered. They developed a language of their own, built on shared jokes, training sessions, and the quiet silence of the fortress. Ciri looked at the white-haired mutant and saw the most reliable man in the world, while Geralt looked at the ashen-haired girl and saw the only reason he had to keep fighting. The isolation of Kaer Morhen was the crucible that turned the law of surprise into a genuine emotional bond. They were no longer a Witcher and his ward. They were the White Wolf and his cub. Ultimately, taking Ciri to Kaer Morhen was the most important act of Geralt's life. It was where he gave her the tools to survive, and where she gave him the reason to live. He realized that while he couldn't protect her from her destiny, he could make sure she was ready to meet it on her own terms. The training was grueling, and the winter was cold, but the bond they formed in those ruins was unbreakable. Geralt had brought a princess into a mutant stronghold, and in doing so, had created a family out of the wreckage of a burning kingdom. The winter at Kaer Morhen was the last moment of peace they would share, before the world realized they were there, and the hunt began in earnest. Section 4. The Witcher 1, Amnesia and Salamandra. Part 12. The Rivian Pogrom and the Years That Were Lost. The event that ended Geralt's first life and set the stage for the game trilogy was the horrific Rivian Pogrom in 1268. Geralt had travelled to the city of Rivia to meet with Dandelion and Zoltan, hoping for a quiet period of rest after the long wars with Nilfgaard had finally ended. However, a trivial argument in a tavern escalated into a full-scale race riot, with the human citizens of Rivia turning on the non-human residents with a genocidal fury. Geralt, consistent in his inability to remain neutral when the innocent were being slaughtered, drew his sword to protect his dwarven and elven friends. In the middle of the chaos, a young man named Rob, terrified and desperate, lunged at Geralt with a pitchfork, piercing the witcher's chest and killing him in the mud of the street. As Geralt lay dying, Yennefer arrived and exhausted her own life force in a desperate, futile attempt to heal him. She collapsed over his body, and for a few moments it seemed the story of the White Wolf and the Obsidian Star had ended in a muddy street in Rivia. However, Ciri appeared, using the power of her elder blood to intervene. She transported the bodies of Geralt and Yennefer away from the continent, moving them to the mystical Isle of Malus, a place outside of time where they could heal and live in peace. This was the death of the legend, a moment where the world assumed the Witcher and the Sorceress were gone forever. Geralt spent years on that island in a state of limbo, a period of tranquility that was eventually shattered by the arrival of the Wild Hunt. Eredin and his riders, still searching for Ciri, tracked the resonance of her magic to the Isle of Malus. They captured Yennefer, intending to use her as bait to lure the Lady of Space and Time out of hiding. Geralt, waking from his limbo and regaining his protective instincts, pursued the hunt across the spheres, eventually making the bargain to trade his own soul for Yennefer's freedom. He spent a year riding as one of the spectral Red Riders, a period of existence that stripped away his identity and his memory. When he finally escaped or was released, he was found running through the woods near Kaer Morhen, confused, exhausted, and possessing no memory of his past, his loves, or his daughter. And these years that were lost are the foundational mystery of the first game, a gap in his life that the player must help him fill. The amnesia was more than just a psychological condition. It was a total erasure of the man Geralt had become. He knew how to hold a sword and how to cast a sign, but he didn't know why he carried a wolf medallion or who the woman in his dreams was. He was a tabula rasa, a blank slate wandering through a world that remembered his deeds even if he didn't. This state of limbo allowed the world to redefine him, and it allowed Geralt to see the continent with fresh eyes. He was no longer the butcher of Blaviken or the hero of the bridge. He was just a nameless witcher searching for a reason to keep moving. The trauma of Rivia and the horror of the Wild Hunt had broken his mind, leaving him as a stranger in his own life. The Rivian pogrom and the loss of his memory were the events that transitioned Geralt from the world of the books into the world of the games. He had died as a hero and been reborn as a mystery. The years that were lost were a crucible that prepared him for a new kind of path, one where he would have to rebuild his identity from the ground up while the world crumbled around him. The pitchfork in Rivia had ended his story, but the amnesia at Kaer Morhen had started a new one. Geralt of Rivia was back, but he was a man who had to learn the value of his own name all over again. Part 19. Letho of Gulet and the Viper's Plan. Letho of Gulet stands as one of the most imposing figures Geralt of Rivia ever faced, not merely because of his massive, mountain-like physique, but because he represented the dark reflection of a witcher's potential when turned toward political regicide. A member of the largely forgotten School of the Viper, Letho was a man of startling contradictions. Despite his appearance as a dim-witted brute with arms the size of tree trunks and a neck that seemed carved from granite. He possessed a tactical mind that rivaled the finest generals of the north. He was a master of poisons, alchemy, and high-stakes espionage, moving through the royal courts of the northern kingdoms with the grace of a predator and the precision of an assassin. Letho was not driven by a personal hatred of kings or a desire for chaos. His motivations were far more pragmatic and, in a strange way, loyal to the dying breed of witches. He had made a bargain with the Emperor of Nilfgaard to destabilize the north in exchange for the restoration of the Viper School, proving that even a mutant could be driven by a desperate need for a home and a legacy. The history between Geralt and Letho was a complex web of debt and mutual respect that predated Geralt's amnesia. Years before the events of the games, Geralt had saved Letho's life from a manticore, an act of professional solidarity that Letho never forgot. In return, when Geralt chose to trade his soul to the Wild Hunt to save Yennefer, it was Letho and two other Viper Witches who looked after the amnesiac sorceress, while they protected her in the heart of Nilfgaardian territory, dealing with her erratic behavior and the political danger she represented. This shared history meant that when they finally faced each other in the ruins of the north, they weren't just two enemies. They were two brothers of the blade who had been placed on opposite sides of a global conflict. Letho's betrayal of the Witcher's Code was, in his mind, a necessary evil to ensure that his school would not follow the path of the wolf into extinction. Letho's plan, orchestrated by the White Flame, was a masterclass in psychological and political warfare. By assassinating King Demavend of Eden and King Foltest of Temeria, he didn't just remove two powerful leaders. He shattered the unity of the northern kingdoms. He knew that the north was a tinderbox of petty rivalries, and by lighting the fuse of regicide, he ensured that the kingdoms would be too busy fighting each other to notice the black-clad legions of Nilfgaard crossing the Yaruga. He used the Lodge of Sorceresses as a convenient scapegoat, letting them take the blame for the chaos while he moved through the shadows. Letho was a sympathetic monster because he never lied to Geralt about his actions. He viewed his work as a grim contract, one that required him to burn the world down so that his brothers could have a place to sleep. He was a man who had accepted his role as a villain to be the savior of his own kind. The final confrontation between Geralt and Letho at the end of the second game was not a traditional boss fight, but a profound philosophical exchange. Letho laid out the entire conspiracy, she explaining his motives and his history, with Geralt with a calm, clinical honesty. He didn't ask for forgiveness, nor did he offer a defense for the blood on his hands. He simply presented the facts of the deal he had made. The player was forced to decide if this man, who had looked after Yennefer and honored his debt to Geralt, deserved to die for the political crimes he had committed. Killing him felt like an act of justice for the kings, but letting him go felt like an acknowledgement of the impossible choices witches are forced to make in a world of empires. Letho was the evidence that a witcher's skills were too dangerous to be left in the hands of desperate men, and his story served as the final warning that the Third Northern War was no longer a threat, but a reality. Letho's legacy is one of the most enduring what-if scenarios in the series. If he lived, he became a ghost, a man whose name was synonymous with the fall of the North, but whose face was known only to a few. He represented the total collapse of the Witcher's ideal of neutrality. He had tried to save his school by serving an emperor, only to find that emperors have no use for witches once the war is won. He and Geralt were two sides of the same coin. Both were used by the powerful, both were feared by the common folk, and both were trying to find a way to survive in a world that was rapidly outgrowing their necessity. The Kingslayer arc was the bridge that led Geralt back to his own memories, and Letho was the one who handed him the keys to his past, even as he used those same hands to tear the North apart. The story of the Viper and the Wolf remains a testament to the fact that loyalty is a luxury that few mutants can afford. Part 20. The Summit at Loch Muin and the Third War. The ancient elven city of Loch Muin, hidden deep within the Blue Mountains, served as the stage for the final collapse of the Old Order of the North. Once a pinnacle of elven architecture and learning, the city was now a crumbling ruin, filled with the ghosts of a slaughtered civilization, a fitting backdrop for a summit that was doomed from the start. The leaders of the northern kingdoms, the representatives of the Lodge of Sorceresses and the Knights of the Order of the Flaming Rose, gathered there to decide the fate of Temeria and Aedan and to re-establish the conclave of mages. It was supposed to be a moment of diplomacy and reconstruction, but it quickly devolved into a nightmare of accusations, betrayals, and magical violence. Geralt arrived at Loch Muin not as a delegate, but as a man searching for the truth behind the assassinations, only to find that the truth was far more terrifying than a single Kingslayer. The failure of the summit was rooted in the absolute inability of the northern leaders to put aside their petty ambitions, even as the Nilfgaardian Empire stood poised to strike. Radovid of Redania, Henselt of Cadwyn, and the various nobles of Temeria spent more time squabbling over borders and succession than they did addressing the threat of the South. This political paralysis allowed the Lodge of Sorceresses to attempt a power grab that backfired spectacularly. Philippa Eilhart and Ciel de Tanseville had been manipulating the political landscape for years, intending to create a puppet state in the Pontar Valley, ruled by a dragon in human form. When their conspiracy was exposed, it didn't lead to a new order. It led to a bloodbath. The mages were purged, the summit dissolved into chaos, and the last remaining bastions of northern unity were incinerated in the flames of a dragon's breath and the zealotry of the witch hunters. For Geralt, Loch Muin was the place where the fragments of his life finally came back together. Through conversations with Letho and the recovery of lost documents, the amnesia that had defined his second life was finally shattered. He remembered the Isle of Malice, the night in Rivia, and the specific, agonizing bargain he had made with Eredin and the Wild Hunt. He realized that Yennefer was alive and being held in Nilfgaard, and that Ciri had returned to the world, fleeing a threat that was older than the kingdoms themselves. This recovery of memory was not a moment of triumph, but one of profound weight. He was no longer a blank slate. He was a man who remembered his failures, his loves, and the absolute danger his family was in. The political collapse of the North was merely the backdrop to the personal urgency of his quest to find the people he loved. The end of the summit was the signal for the start of the Third Northern War. As the mages were hunted through the streets and the kings fled back to their respective territories, the Nilfgaardian legions began their march across the Yaruga. The Northern Order was dead, replaced by a landscape of fear and religious fanaticism. Radovid the Stern emerged as the only leader with the ruthlessness to stand against the South, but his version of protection involved burning anyone who possessed a drop of magic. Geralt watched as the world he had tried to save from Salamandra and the Kingslayers fell into a state of total war. He realized that neutrality was no longer a choice he could make. The world was being carved into two, and he was standing in the middle of a graveyard. He left Loch Muin with a clear destination, the south, where the trail of Yennefer and Ciri finally began. The ruins of Loch Muin remain a symbol of the transition from the world of kings to the world of the apocalypse. It was the last time the civilized world tried to govern itself through reason, before the dark ages of the Third War truly began. For Geralt, the city was a crucible that burned away the amnesia and left behind the White Wolf in his most focused form. He had navigated the games of the royalty and the sorceresses and come out with nothing but his swords and his memory. The second game concluded with the realization that the monsters Geralt had been hunting were merely the preamble. The real threat was riding on the wind, and the continent was about to learn that there are some things that even a witcher cannot kill. The stage was set for the final hunt, where the fate of the North would be decided not by kings at a summit, but by a father and a daughter in a world of ice and fire. Section 6, The Witcher 3, The Hunt and the Search. Part 21, White Orchard and the World That Had Changed. When Geralt of Rivia arrived in the village of White Orchard at the beginning of the Third Northern War, he was no longer walking the familiar path of his youth. He was moving through a landscape that had been fundamentally broken by the machinery of imperial conquest. The village, once a quiet farming community, was now a microcosm of the war's absolute brutality. The fields were filled with the charred remains of homesteads. The orchards were hung with the bodies of deserters and traitors, and the air was thick with the smell of wet rot and the carrion birds that followed the Nilfgaardian army. This was the no-man's land that the war had created, a place where the laws of the North had been replaced by the clinical, unyielding bureaucracy of the Black One. Geralt, accompanied by his mentor Vesemir, moved through this world as an outsider once again. But this time, the stakes weren't just about a single monster contract. The visual shift in the world was staggering. Other vibrant colors of the previous years had been replaced by a palette of mud, grey, and the harsh black of Nilfgaardian steel. The common folk of White Orchard were trapped between two evils: the occupiers who took their grain and their children, and the remnants of the northern armies who had turned into brigands and scavengers. Geralt saw the way the war had eroded the human spirit. People were no longer afraid of drowners or ghouls, as much as they were afraid of their neighbours or the soldiers at the garrison. This new, grimmer world was one where the distinction between a monster and a man had finally vanished. Geralt's witcher senses were constantly overwhelmed by the sheer volume of death that surrounded him, a sensory reminder that he was now a witness to the end of an era. The search for Yennefer acted as the primary driver for Geralt's presence in the village, but it forced him to engage with the occupation in a way that challenged his lifelong commitment to neutrality. To get the information he needed from the Nilfgaardian commander, Geralt was forced to take a contract to kill a local griffin that was terrorizing the supply lines. He was no longer just a witcher performing a public service. He was a tool being used by an invading empire to facilitate their logistics. This transaction was a bitter pill for Geralt to swallow, as it placed him in the position of a collaborator in the eyes of the local peasants. He realized that in a world of total war, there is no geography left for neutrality to stand on. Every action, even hunting a monster, had a political weight that could not be ignored. Vesemir's presence in White Orchard provided a final, poignant link to the old world of the Witchers. The two of them tracked the griffin together, with the master teaching the student one last time in the middle of a battlefield. Vesemir represented the continuity of the Wolf School, a man who had seen a dozen wars and still maintained a sense of professional detachment. However, even he could see that this war was different. The scale of the destruction and the arrival of the Wild Hunt signaled that the time of the witches was drawing to a close. Their conversations in the village and the tavern were a goodbye to the simplicity of the path. They were two mutants in a world that was rapidly becoming too monstrous for even them to navigate. The arrival of the Nilfgaardian Empire in the village also introduced Geralt to the clinical efficiency of the South. Unlike the chaotic, emotional cruelty of the Northern Lords, the Nilfgaardians brought a cold, administrative approach to their occupation. They didn't just burn the village, they measured its output and taxed its misery. This contrast emphasized the hopelessness of the situation for the common folk. Geralt saw that whether the North won or the South, the people of White Orchard would remain the victims. He moved through the village as a shadow, a man looking for a woman and a daughter in a world that was busy burying its own. The first steps of his final journey were taken in the mud of a conquered orchard, a reminder that the White Wolf's path would always lead through the wreckage of human ambition. Part 22. Velen, Novigrad, Skellige. Following Ciri's trail. The search for Ciri across the continent transformed the third game into a grand, multiversal detective story, where Geralt used his specialized skills not to hunt a beast, but to piece together the movements of a legend. The trail led through 3 distinct regions, each representing a different facet of the world's collapse. In Velen, the no man's land, Geralt found a province that had been abandoned by god and king alike. A place of ancient, dark magic, where the soil was soaked in blood and the trees whispered secrets. Here, Ciri had been a refugee, moving through the swamps and the haunted woods, leaving behind clues that suggested she was fleeing something far more terrifying than the Nilfgaardian army. Geralt had to navigate the influence of the crones and the desperation of the bloody Baron just to find a single scrap of her clothing or a memory of her ashen hair. In Novigrad, the free city, the search moved from the mud of the swamp to the cobblestones of the metropolis. This was a hunt through the urban underworld, where Ciri had sought the help of mages, criminals, and the bard Dandelion. Geralt found himself in a maze of stone and religious fanaticism, tracking Ciri's footsteps through the back alleys and the high society solar rooms. He realized that in the city, Ciri had been a whirlwind of activity, trying to break a curse and find a way to escape her pursuers. The trail here was one of broken contracts and hidden messages, revealing a Ciri who was no longer a child, but a woman of incredible resourcefulness and power. Geralt had to become a creature of the city, dealing with gang leaders and inquisitors to find the woman who had already vanished into the fog. The final leg of the initial search took Geralt to the Skellige Isles, the rugged, windswept archipelago where the old ways still held sway. In Skellige, the trail was marked by a massive explosion of magical energy and a desperate battle on the shores of Hindisfjall. Geralt used the skills of the Lady of Space and Time as his primary lead, realizing that Ciri had been jumping between worlds and leaving behind a magical resonance that could be felt across the islands. He worked with the clans and the druids to reconstruct the final moments of her flight, seeing a girl who was being hunted by the spectral riders of the Wild Hunt. The trail in Skellige was the most urgent, as it proved that Eredin was closing the gap and that Ciri's time was running out. Each of these regions provided a different piece of the puzzle that was Ciri's new identity. Geralt saw that she had become a protector of the weak in Velen, a daring rebel in Novigrad, and a desperate fugitive in Skellige. He wasn't just finding her location, he was finding out who she was. He realized that the lion cub of Cintra had outgrown the training of Kaer Morhen and had become a being of unimaginable significance. The search was a journey of fatherhood through the lens of a professional investigator, where every scent of elder blood and every blink in the air brought him closer to a reunion that he feared as much as he desired. He saw that the world was being reshaped by her presence, and that the wild hunt was merely the most visible part of the storm she carried. The detective story of elder blood was also a journey of rediscovery for Geralt. As he followed Ciri, he was forced to revisit his own past and the people who had shaped him. He saw the impact of his own training on the way she handled a blade, and the influence of Yennefer's discipline on the way she managed her power. The search was a reflection of his own life, a long, difficult road filled with monsters and difficult choices. By the time he finally reached the Isle of Mists, he had a complete picture of the woman he was about to meet. He had followed her through the mud, the stone, and the sea, and he had learned that Ciri was no longer someone to be saved, but someone to be stood beside. The trail ended in the silence of the mists, but the story it told was one of a girl who had finally become the mistress of her own destiny. Chapter 23. Emir's Request. The audience with Emhyr var Emreis in the occupied palace of Visenna was one of the most tense and psychologically charged moments in Geralt's life. Standing before the white flame, the man who had ordered the invasion of the north and the destruction of Cintra, Geralt was forced to confront the biological father of the girl he considered his own daughter. Emhyr sat upon his throne with a cold, imperial detachment, viewing the world as a game of chess, where everyone, including his daughter, was a piece to be moved. He hired Geralt to find Ciri, not out of a sense of paternal love, but out of a dynastic necessity. He wanted an heir to his empire, a successor who carried the elder blood and could ensure the dominance of the Nilfgaardian sun across the multiverse. This request created an immediate and profound friction. The Emperor wanted a tool, while the Witcher wanted a daughter who was free. Geralt's decision to take the Emperor's coin was not an act of loyalty to the South, but a pragmatic calculation. He knew that finding Ciri required resources and information that only an empire could provide. However, he made it clear from the beginning that his primary loyalty was to Ciri's safety and autonomy. He moved through the halls of Visenna as a man who was being tolerated rather than welcomed, a mutant who was being used by a king but who refused to bow. The friction between the biological father and the emotional father was the subtext of every interaction. Emhyr represented the world of duty and throne, while Geralt represented the world of love and the path. This conflict would eventually decide Ciri's fate, as the player had to choose whether to lead her back to her father's empire or let her choose her own life. Yennefer's role in this arrangement added another layer of complexity to the family dynamic. She had aligned herself with the Empire to use their mages and their intelligence network to find Ciri, a move that Geralt found both necessary and disturbing. They were a family working for the man who had destroyed their home, a compromise that reflected the desperate stakes of the situation. The search for Ciri became an imperial priority, with Nilfgaardian spies and garrisons providing Geralt with leads that a solitary witcher would never have found. However, this support came with the constant pressure of Emhyr's expectations. Every report Geralt sent back to Visenna was a piece of information that the Emperor could use to tighten the noose around his daughter's future. The audience also highlighted the fundamental difference in how the two men viewed Ciri's power. To Emhyr, the elder blood was a political asset, a way to solidify his rule and fulfill a prophecy of global dominance. To Geralt, it was the very thing that made her life a nightmare. a curse that had brought the wild hunt to her door. This disagreement was the heart of the successor versus daughter conflict. Emhyr wanted to put her in a crown. Geralt wanted to keep her in the saddle. The tension in the room was palpable, as two of the most powerful and stubborn men on the continent sized each other up, both claiming a right to the same girl for entirely different reasons. Geralt left the presence of the White Flame with a heavy purse, but a heavier heart, knowing that the real battle for Ciri's soul was just beginning. In the end, Emhyr's request was the contract that defined the final game, but it was one that Geralt intended to fulfill on his own terms. He used the Emperor's gold to buy the swords and the potions he needed to protect Ciri from her father's world. He saw that the Empire was just another monster to be navigated, a predator of a different kind that wanted to consume the girl's potential to feed its own hunger. The search for Ciri was a race against both the Wild Hunt and the Nilfgaardian sun, and Geralt was the only one in the middle who truly cared about the girl's happiness. He was the Witcher, the father, and the secret rebel, moving through a world of empires to save a princess who was done with being a prize. Chapter 24. The Crones, the Baron, and the Weight of Velen. The Family Matters questline in the swamps of Velen is widely regarded as the emotional core of the search for Ciri, serving as a grim mirror for Geralt's own complicated relationship with fatherhood and the choices that define a family. Upon arriving in Velen, Geralt was forced to deal with Philip Strenger, known as the Bloody Baron, a man who ruled over the province with a drunken, violent grit. The Baron was a man who had lost his wife and daughter, and he offered Geralt information on Ciri in exchange for finding them. Through this quest, Geralt encountered the monsters of Velen, not just the necrophages in the mud, but the domestic horror of a broken home. The Baron was a man who loved his family, but had destroyed them through his own flaws. A character whose complexity taught Geralt that the most difficult monsters to hunt are the ones that live inside the human heart. The investigation led Geralt into the heart of Crookback Bog, where he encountered the crones of Crookback Bog, Brues, Weaves, and Wispes. These ancient, malevolent entities represented the old power structures of the continent, beings who had ruled the swamp since before the arrival of the first humans. They were the ones who had hosted Ciri when she first arrived in Velen, and they were the ones who had attempted to eat her to claim the power of her blood. The crones were a nightmare of folk horror, a trio of grotesque sisters who demanded blood and obedience from the local peasants in exchange for survival. They were the true masters of Velen, and their interaction with Ciri and the Baron's family showed that in the no man's land, the only thing that matters is the strength of the deal you can make with the dark. The quest involving the botchling, the cursed spirit of the Baron's unborn child, was the most visceral manifestation of the weight of Velen. Geralt had to perform a ritual to either kill the creature or turn it into a Blaviken, a guardian spirit. This choice was a direct reflection of Geralt's own role as a father figure. He was dealing with the consequences of a man's failure to protect his child, a scenario that resonated with his own fear of failing Ciri. The ritual was a moment of profound emotional weight, where the Witcher's magic was used not to kill, but to heal a family's trauma. It showed that Geralt's path was no longer just about silver and steel. It was about the heavy, messy work of redemption in a world that rarely offers it. The crone's involvement with the orphans of the bog and the whispering hillock created a moral dilemma that had no good outcome. Geralt had to choose between saving a group of children or protecting the nearby village from a spirit's wrath, a decision that eventually led to either the death of the Baron's wife or the destruction of an entire community. This was the Velen reality, a world where every choice had a terrible cost. The Baron's story, regardless of the ending, concluded with a man who was forced to face the wreckage of his life. He served as a warning to Geralt about the fragility of the father-daughter bond and the danger of letting one's own demons destroy the people they love. Ultimately, the Velen arc was the crucible that prepared Geralt for the reunion with Ciri. It stripped away the political pretensions of the Vizima audience and returned him to the dirt and the blood of the human experience. He learned that the Child of Destiny was a light that every monster in the world, from the crones to the Baron, wanted to capture or consume. The weight of Velen was the realization that protection is a full-time job that requires more than just a sword. It requires an understanding of the trauma that people carry and a willingness to stand in the mud with them. Geralt left the swamp with the clues he needed, but he also left with a deeper understanding of what it meant to be a father in a world where even the trees are hungry for your children. Part 25, Novigrad and the Eternal Fire. The transition from the sodden marshes of Velen to the towering spires of Novigrad represented a shift from the primal horrors of the swamp to the sophisticated systemic cruelty of a civilized metropolis. Novigrad, the free city, was once a beacon of trade and intellectual exchange, but Geralt found it transformed into a claustrophobic cage of religious paranoia and state-sponsored terror. The Church of the Eternal Fire, led by the fanatical Caleb Menger and the Temple Guard, had launched a brutal campaign of persecution against mages and non-humans. Pyres burned in the Hierarch Square, turning the city's air into a thick, oily haze of ash and bone. For Geralt, a man whose life was intertwined with sorceresses and non-human friends, the city was a minefield. He was looking for Dandelion, who had been the last person to see Ciri in the city, but to find the bard, he had to navigate a landscape where a single wrong word could lead to the dungeons of Tretogor Gate. The search for Dandelion forced Geralt into the belly of the Novigrad underworld, a realm ruled by the Big Four crime lords. He found himself performing tasks for Sigi Reuven, the former Redanian spy master Sigismund Dijkstra, and the King of Beggars. Realizing that the criminals of the city were often more reasonable than the holy men on the pyres. Geralt's investigation revealed that Dandelion and Ciri had attempted to pull off a daring heist against Dijkstra's vault to fund a way to break a curse on Avalar. The trail was a masterclass in urban tracking, leading Geralt through high society brothels, hidden mage hideouts, and the bloody torture chambers of the witch hunters. He saw that Ciri had been a whirlwind of activity in the city, using her wits and her blade to survive an environment that was actively trying to purge her kind. The free city was a misnomer. It was a city of walls and whispers, and Ciri had been the one spark that refused to go out. The persecution of mages served as a constant, looming threat throughout the Novigrad arc. Geralt witnessed the systematic dismantling of the city's magical community, helping Triss Merigold organize a mass exodus of sorcerers and alchemists through the city's sewers. This plotline highlighted the absolute failure of the social contract in the north. The Church of the Eternal Fire used the fear of the war and the other to consolidate power, creating a climate where neighbors betrayed each other for a bag of groats. Geralt, as a mutant, was a prime target for this bigotry. He moved through the streets with his hood up, his cat eyes hooded, feeling the weight of the city's hatred on his back. The urban environment was far more exhausting than the path. It was a place where the monsters wore red robes and preached about salvation while sharpening their executioner's blades. Finding Dandelion required Geralt to participate in a series of increasingly absurd and dangerous scenarios, from directing a play to staging a prison break. When the bard was finally rescued, the information he provided was the final piece of the Novigrad puzzle. He described Ciri's desperate escape from the temple guard and her blink out of the city, a move that had saved her life but had left her trail cold once again. Dandelion's account was one of a Ciri who was tired, hunted, and rapidly losing options. Geralt realized that the city he had always considered a temporary refuge for his friends had become a death trap. The rescue of Dandelion was a personal victory, but the political reality of Novigrad remained a scar on the continent. The city was a monument to the fact that when humans stop fearing monsters in the woods, they start inventing monsters among themselves. The atmosphere of Novigrad was one of decaying grandeur. Behind the wealthy facades of the merchant houses and the vibrant colours of the markets lay a reality of starvation, fear, and organised crime. Geralt's witcher senses in the city were bombarded by the scents of perfume and sewage, the sounds of prayers and screams. He saw that the eternal fire was a flame that consumed everything it touched, leaving behind only the cold ash of conformity. The city taught Geralt that the most dangerous place for Ciri wasn't the swamp of Velen, but the civilized streets of a place that had lost its moral compass. He left Novigrad with a sense of urgency, heading toward the Skellige Isles, the only place left where the fire of the Inquisitors had not yet reached, and where the trail of the Elder Blood promised a final destination. Part 26. Skellige and the Politics of the Krach and Kroit. The arrival in the Skellige Isles marked a return to a wilder, more ancient world, where the rules of kings and inquisitors were replaced by the laws of the sea and the honour of the clans. Skellige was a rugged archipelago of jagged peaks and freezing waters, a place that Geralt had always felt a certain kinship with, due to its brutal honesty. Here, he found his old friend Krach and Kroit, the Jarl of Kaer who had looked after Ciri during her childhood summers. The islands were in the midst of a succession crisis following the death of King Bran, and Geralt found himself drawn into the politics of the clans even as he searched for the ashen-haired girl. The search for Ciri was intertwined with the fate of the throne, as Geralt aided Kraka's children, Hjalmar and Cheris, in their own quests for glory and leadership. The trail in Skellige was the most magical and destructive of them all. Geralt investigated the site of a massive magical explosion on the island of Ardskellig, realizing that Ciri and Avalar had been engaged in a desperate battle with the Wild Hunt upon their arrival. He used the Mask of Ouroboros with Yennefer to witness the echoes of the past, seeing Ciri's power manifest in a way that had leveled entire forests. This was a different kind of tracking. He was following the ripples in the fabric of reality itself. The evidence pointed to a Ciri who was no longer just running. She was fighting back with a power that was starting to slip from her control. The islands, with their thin veil between worlds, provided the perfect stage for the Wild Hunt's spectral riders to close the gap, leaving the village of Lofoten in ruins and the local population haunted by the cold ghost. Skellige's politics were a matter of blood and heritage, a mirror for Ciri's own struggle with her ancestry. Geralt's involvement in the coronation of the new ruler, whether the reckless Hjalmar or the calculating Ceres, was a testament to his influence on the history of the North. He saw that the clans of Skellige, despite their internal feuds, possessed a fierce loyalty to those they considered family. Krach and Kroit viewed Ciri as a daughter of the islands, and his resources were placed entirely at Geralt's disposal. This stood in stark contrast to the Emperor's request in Visenna. The Skelligers wanted to protect Ciri because they loved her, not because they wanted to rule through her. The archipelago was the only place on the continent where Ciri was seen as a person before she was seen as a prophecy. The search eventually led Geralt to the mystery of the ugly baby, a creature known as Uma, who had been found on the shores of Skellige following the magical explosion. Geralt realized that this creature was the key to finding Ciri, as it carried a powerful curse that masked its true identity. The investigation in Skellige was the final preparation for the reunion, a journey that involved diving into ancient elven ruins and consulting with druids like Ermion. Geralt saw that the Wild Hunt was not just a threat to Ciri, but a threat to the world itself, as their arrival brought the white frost to the shores of the islands. The search was a race against the winter, a desperate attempt to find the girl before the spectral riders could claim her. The rugged beauty of Skellige provided a sharp contrast to the mud of Velen and the ash of Novigrad. It was a land of giants, dragons, and berserkers, a place where a witch's skills were respected rather than feared. Geralt felt the weight of his years on the islands, remembering the nights he had spent in the halls of Kaer and the promises he had made to Calanthe. The search for Ciri was a homecoming of sorts, a return to the roots of his bond with the lion cub. He left the islands with Uma in his saddlebags, heading toward the mountain fortress of Kaer Morhen for a final, desperate attempt to break the curse and find his daughter. The trail had led across the world, and it was finally leading back to where it all began, the home of the wolves. Section 7. The Hunt Ends. Part 27. Ciri Found. The journey to the Isle of Mists was the most surreal and vulnerable sequence in Geralt's life. A quiet passage through the veil of reality to find the girl he had been hunting across 3 games and a century of history. Following the clues provided by the lifting of Uma's curse, which revealed the elven sage Avalark, Geralt sailed into the heart of a magical anomaly where time and space seemed to lose their meaning. The island was a place of silence and shadows, a world apart from the wars and the politics of the continent. Geralt moved through the mists with a singular focus, his usual cynicism replaced by a cold, hollow fear that he might be too late. When he finally reached the small cottage in the center of the island, he found Ciri in a state of catatonic limbo, her soul seemingly lost to the void of her last interdimensional jump. The moment of their reunion was the emotional peak of the entire saga. Geralt entered the room and saw the girl he had raised as a daughter, lying cold and motionless on a bed, the child of destiny reduced to a flickering candle in the dark. For a man who claimed to have no emotions, Geralt's grief was a physical force. He held her body, the silence of the room amplifying the weight of his failure. It was only through the residual magic of the will-o'-the-wisp that Ciri was finally awakened, her eyes opening to see the white-haired man who had spent his life looking for her. The reunion was not marked by grand declarations, but by a quiet, desperate embrace. The white wolf and the lion cub were finally together, a moment that felt like the closing of a circle that had been drawn decades ago in the banquet hall of Cintra. Ciri's state, upon being found, revealed the absolute toll that the elder blood had taken on her. She was exhausted, haunted by the echoes of the worlds she had visited, and possessed a weary wisdom that made her seem older than Geralt himself. She spoke of the Wild Hunt not as a legend, but as a relentless, physical pressure that had followed her through every sphere of existence. Their dynamic had shifted. She was no longer the student in need of protection, but an equal partner who understood the stakes of the coming battle. Geralt saw that the girl he had trained at Kaer Morhen had become a being of unimaginable power, yet she was still the same person who valued his opinion above all others. Their reunion was a transition from father and ward to a coalition of two survivors who were ready to face the end of the world together. The island sequence also served as a moment of clarity for Geralt's own story. He realized that the amnesia, the Kingslayers, and the wars were all just the preamble to this single moment of connection. His entire second life had been a long, difficult road leading to the Isle of Mists. He saw that destiny was not a cage, but a bridge that had brought him back to the only person who made the path worth walking. The mists of the island lifted as they prepared to leave, signaling that the period of hiding was over. They weren't just going back to the continent, they were going back to the fight. Geralt felt a sense of purpose that he hadn't felt since the night in Rivia, a resolve to ensure that this time he would not be the one left behind. Leaving the Isle of Mists was the start of the final act. Ciri's return to the world was a signal to the Wild Hunt that the prize was back on the board. Geralt knew that the moment they landed on the shores of the continent, the chase would resume with a lethal intensity. He looked at the girl sitting in the boat beside him and saw the future of the world, but more importantly, he saw his daughter. The reunion had given him back his heart, and he was prepared to use every mutation, every sign, and every drop of Witcher steel to protect it. They sailed out of the mists and toward Kaer Morhen, the fortress of the wolves, where the final stand against the king of the Wild Hunt would finally take place. Part 28. Preparing for Eredin. The return to Kaer Morhen was not a homecoming of peace, but a desperate fortification of a ruin. Geralt and Ciri arrived at the mountain keep to find it populated by the few allies they had managed to gather from across the continent. Yennefer, Triss, the Witchers, Eskel, and Lambert, and a handful of loyal friends like Roche and Letho. The atmosphere was one of grim determination, a last stand for the Wolf School against an enemy that transcended the mortal realm. They spent their final hours preparing the defenses, brewing potions, and setting magical traps. Geralt moved through the familiar halls of his youth, seeing the keep not as a training ground, but as a graveyard in the making. He was the one who had brought the war to the Witcher's doorstep, and the weight of that responsibility sat heavy on his shoulders. The Battle of Kaer Morhen was a chaotic, freezing nightmare of ice and steel. The Wild Hunt arrived in a torrent of magical frost, their spectral ships appearing in the sky like omens of the end. The defense was a frantic struggle to keep the riders from the inner sanctum where Ciri was hidden. Geralt fought with a ferocity he had never displayed before, his mutations pushed to their absolute limit by the alchemical decoctions. He saw his brothers fighting beside him, the last of the Witchers defending their home, against a force that didn't care about their code or their steel. The air was thick with the scent of ozone and the sound of clashing blades, a symphony of destruction that echoed through the valley of the Morhen. It was the moment the world of the Witchers finally collided with the world of the prophecy. The turning point of the battle was the death of Vesemir. In a desperate attempt to protect Ciri from Eredin's general, Imlerith, the old master-at-arms sacrificed his own life, dying with a defiant smile and a final act of protection. His death was the catalyst for an uncontrolled eruption of Ciri's elder blood power, a wave of sonic and magical energy that sent the Wild Hunt retreating back into the void. For Geralt, the loss of Vesemir was the loss of his only true father. the death of the man who had shaped him and the school he belonged to. Standing over Vesemir's body in the burning courtyard, Geralt realized that the era of the old witches was truly over. He was now the eldest of the wolf school, the one who had to lead the remnants of his family into the final confrontation. Vesemir's funeral was a quiet, heartbreaking moment of closure. They burned his body on a pyre in the shadow of the keep, the smoke rising toward the same mountains that had witnessed the trials of the grasses centuries before. The death of the master had transformed the mission. It was no longer just about survival, it was about vengeance. Ciri, consumed by grief and guilt, found a new resolve to end Eredin's pursuit once and for all. Geralt saw that the girl had become a woman of iron, her eyes reflecting the same cold determination that had once defined her grandmother, Calanthe. The Battle of Kaer Morhen had been a defeat in many ways, but it had forged a coalition that was no longer afraid of the dark. They were the survivors. She and they were ready to take the fight to the enemy's world. The aftermath of the battle led to a period of tactical preparation. They realized that they couldn't just wait for the hunt to return. They had to lure Eredin into a trap on their own terms. This led to the retrieval of the Sunstone and the alliance with the Lodge of Sorceresses, a group Geralt had spent his life distrusting. He saw that to save Ciri, he had to become a leader of a different kind, navigating the egos of mages and the politics of emperors. The preparation was a race against the clock as the white frost continued to creep closer to the continent. Geralt moved through the final days of the hunt with a clarity of purpose that had been missing for years. He was the White Wolf, and the scent of the king of the wild hunt was finally in his nostrils. Part 29. The Battle and the Isle of Mists, Undvik. The final confrontation took place on the shores of Undvik, in the Skellige Isles, a desolate frozen landscape that served as the terminal point for the hunt that had spanned the multiverse. Geralt led a coalition of Skellige warriors, Nilfgaardian soldiers, and the Lodge of Sorceresses in a massive coordinated attack to draw out the wild hunt using the Sunstone. The sea was filled with the wreckage of ships and the bodies of men as the spectral Naglfar appeared in a storm of ice and shadow. Geralt moved through the chaos of the battlefield toward the final duel with Eredin Breac Glass. This wasn't just a fight for a contract. It was the culmination of a century of destiny. The mutant and the elven king faced each other on the deck of a dying ship, two predators whose fates had been bound together since the night in Rivia. The duel with Eredin was a masterpiece of lethal combat, a clash of two different styles of mastery. Eredin fought with a cold, aristocratic precision, using his own world-jumping abilities to flicker through the air. Geralt, however, fought with the grit and the desperation of a father. He used every sign, every oil, and every scrap of Witcher training to dismantle the king of the wild hunt. When his blade finally found Eredin's throat, the king's last words were a final, mocking betrayal. Avallac'h has tricked us both. He has taken Ciri. This revelation turned Geralt's victory into ash. He realized that the elven sage he had trusted as a mentor for Ciri had his own agenda, one that involved the final fulfillment of Ithlinne's prophecy and the opening of the Gate of the Worlds. Geralt's final sprint toward the tower on the Isle of Mists, the Skellige version, was a race against the literal end of the world. The white frost had begun to descend in earnest, a biting, cosmic cold that threatened to freeze the continent solid. He found Avallac'h at the center of a magical storm, only to realize that the sage was not a traitor, but a facilitator. Ciri had made the choice to face the white frost herself, to enter the eye of the storm and quench the entropy of the multiverse using the full power of her elder blood. Geralt had to stand by and watch as the girl he had raised walked into a portal that she might never return from. It was the ultimate test of his fatherhood, the ability to let her go and trust that the woman she had become was strong enough to survive. The sequence inside the white frost was a silent, haunting passage for Ciri, while Geralt stood in the snow and remembered the choices he had made. He thought about the snowball fight at Kaer Morhen, the visit to Skjald's grave, and the moments of autonomy he had given her. He realized that his role as a father was not to prevent her from facing the frost, but to give her the confidence to win. The world held its breath as the magical towers hummed with power, and the ice began to recede. It was a moment of absolute vulnerability for the White Wolf, a man who had fought every monster in the world, only to be helpless against the cold of the void. He waited in the silence, a father standing in the wreckage of a battle, waiting for a daughter who had become a god. The victory over the White Frost was the end of the prophecy and the end of the hunt. The wild hunt was destroyed, the frost was pushed back, and the continent was saved. But for Geralt, the only thing that mattered was whether Ciri walked back through that portal. He had spent his life saying he didn't believe in destiny, but at the end of the world, he found that destiny was just a word for the connections we make. He stood on the shores of Undvik as the sun began to rise over a world that was still alive. A man who had survived the apocalypse only to find that the story was finally his own to finish. The battle was over, and the White Wolf was ready for whatever came next, provided he didn't have to walk the path alone. Part 30. The Endings and What They Say About Geralt. The conclusion of Geralt of Rivia's story is not a single point, but a reflection of the small, human choices made throughout the journey, resulting in 3 distinct fates for Ciri and the White Wolf. In the Witcher ending, Ciri fakes her death to escape the burden of her heritage and the politics of the empires. Geralt meets her at a quiet inn in White Orchard, handing her a custom-made silver sword and welcoming her to the life of a professional monster hunter on the path. This is the personal win for Geralt. He has saved his daughter not by making her a queen, but by making her a witcher. It says that for a man who spent his life as an outcast, the greatest gift he can give is the freedom to be one too. They ride off together into a world that is still full of monsters, a father and daughter who have chosen the simple, honest road over the weight of the crown. The Empress ending provides a more bittersweet and political conclusion. Ciri realizes that with her power and her heritage, she has a responsibility to the people of the continent that goes beyond the life of a witcher. She chooses to go to Nilfgaard and take the throne as Emir's successor, intending to change the empire from within and bring a lasting peace to the north. The farewell at White Orchard is one of the most poignant moments in the series, as Geralt realizes he has lost his daughter to the very world he tried to protect her from. This ending says that Geralt was a successful father because he raised a woman who was brave enough to put the needs of the world before her own happiness. It is a sacrifice for both of them, a reminder that the cost of salvation is often the life you wanted to lead. The death ending is the absolute tragedy of the saga, occurring if Geralt fails to provide Ciri with the emotional support and autonomy she needs to survive the trial of the White Frost. In this outcome, Ciri does not return from the ice, and Geralt is left as a hollow shell of a man. He returns to the swamps of Velen to hunt down the last remaining crone and recover Ciri's lost medallion. eventually dying in the mud, surrounded by monsters. This ending is a stark reminder that in the Witcher world, the greatest monster is the failure of love. It says that Geralt's identity was so tied to his role as a protector that without Ciri, he has no reason to exist. It is a dark, nihilistic conclusion to a century of struggle, a final butcher act that leaves the world a little colder than it was before. Where the white wolf ends up after the hunt is also a matter of choice. He might retire to the vineyard of Corvo Bianco in Toussaint, finally finding a sense of peace with Yennefer or Triss, a man who has traded his swords for a glass of wine and a quiet garden. He might continue walking the path until his luck finally runs out, a ghost of a previous era who refuses to stop moving. These outcomes say that Geralt is a man who has finally earned his rest, even if he doesn't quite know how to take it. He has moved from being a child, abandoned at a fortress, to being the savior of the multiverse, a journey that has left him scarred but whole. The story from beginning to end is a testament to the fact that while we cannot choose our birth or our mutations, we can choose our family and our legacy. Geralt of Rivia's story is a masterclass in the evolution of a character. He started as a cynical mutant who believed in nothing but the coin, and he ended as a man who was willing to die for the people he loved. He proved that even in a world of absolute grey, there is a value in trying to do the right thing. His legacy is not the kings he saved or the monsters he killed, but the girl he raised. The White Wolf's journey is the heart of the Witcher saga, a reminder that the most powerful magic in the world isn't found in a spell or a gene, but in the stubborn human refusal to let the world break you. Geralt of Rivia is the legend that remains when the mists finally lift, a man of Rivia who finally found his way home.